Silent Screams presents a chilling series of real horror stories that will make your spine tingle and your heart race. As you listen, try not to look over your shoulder, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you think about the world around you. This is not just another ghost story. This is a collection of true encounters with the unknown, with the unexplained, and with things that shouldn't be possible. If you're ready, then take a deep breath and let the terror begin. It was just another quiet evening for Sarah, or at least, it was supposed to be. The small town she lived in was tucked away, far from the chaos of city life, and she had always thought of it as a peaceful place. But that evening, as the shadows stretched long across the empty streets, she felt an unease she couldn't shake. It started when she entered her home after a long day at work. She was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, but something was off. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though something was pressing down on her, something unseen, something waiting. As Sarah made her way through the house, she noticed the subtle things first. The light in the hallway flickered, but she told herself it was just an old bulb. The wiring probably needed fixing. Still, there was a lingering coldness in the air, despite the warmth of the evening. She ignored it and continued her routine, dropping her keys on the counter and walking into the living room. That's when she noticed it. The front door was slightly ajar. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her pulse suddenly racing. She was certain she had locked the door before leaving earlier that day. With a sense of dread creeping up her spine, she walked over to it. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the house, far too loudly for the quiet neighborhood. As she stepped into the doorway, she looked out onto the porch. Nothing was there. But then, she heard something, a faint scratching sound, coming from upstairs. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had no pets, no animals at all, and the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Her heart began to race, her feet frozen in place. She had to know what it was. Slowly, she ascended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The scratching noise grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever it was upstairs was trying to get out. The tension in the air was unbearable, the cold wrapping around her like a thick, suffocating blanket. As she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated, staring at the hallway ahead. The door to her bedroom was closed, but the scratching seemed to be coming from within. With shaking hands, she reached out to turn the handle. The moment her fingers brushed the metal, the sound stopped abruptly, as if someone or something had heard her. A sense of dread washed over her, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not now. With a deep breath, Sarah opened the door. Her bedroom was empty. There was no one there. Nothing was amiss. Yet, the air felt thick, like the presence of something unseen was still in the room. The feeling of being watched, it was overwhelming. It wasn't until she turned toward the closet that she saw it, a figure standing motionless in the corner of the room, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlights outside. It was a man, but his features were distorted, twisted in a way that no living person could be. His body was unnaturally still, as if he were frozen in place. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as her mind raced, trying to understand what she was seeing. Her hands trembled as she stepped backward, but the figure did not move. It simply stood there, its hollow eyes following her every move. The room suddenly grew even colder. Sarah felt an ice-cold chill run down her spine, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees in mere seconds. The figure began to move, its head tilting at an odd angle, as if it were studying her, considering her presence. Without thinking, Sarah spun around and bolted from the room, running down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she reached the bottom, she felt a hand, cold, clammy, brush against her shoulder. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. The silence was deafening. Desperate to escape, Sarah rushed to the front door, but before she could open it, she heard a voice. It was barely a whisper, but it sent a chill through her very bones. The voice called her name, soft, insistent, like a distant, forgotten memory that was suddenly waking up. Sarah. Sarah, come back. It was her name, but not the voice she knew. This voice was unnatural, strained, as if it had been twisted and distorted by something beyond the grave. She turned toward the sound, her blood running cold. There, in the doorway of the living room, stood the figure again, its face now inches away from hers. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, staring into her soul as though it was trying to pierce her very being. The voice echoed once more, and this time, it wasn't just her name. It was a command. Come closer. With every ounce of fear and instinct in her, Sarah slammed the door open and fled into the night, running as fast as her legs could carry her. The house, the figure, the voice, everything faded behind her as she ran down the empty street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But even as she ran, she knew deep down that this was just the beginning. Something had followed her out of that house, something that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. Something that would not rest until it had claimed her. What Sarah didn't know was that this wasn't just an isolated incident. Many others in the town had experienced strange happenings, too. People had seen things, figures in their homes, whispers in the dark, things moving on their own. It seemed as if the very fabric of reality had begun to fray, allowing the dark, twisted forces lurking just beyond the veil to slip through. And Sarah was not the first to encounter these things. She wouldn't be the last. As she wandered through the streets that night, she began to wonder, was she being watched? Was the thing that had haunted her bedroom still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike? Or had something else taken notice of her, something far worse, something older and more malevolent than she could possibly imagine? The town, once so quiet, had become a breeding ground for the strange and the terrifying. And Sarah had just scratched the surface. What would happen next? Where would this story lead her? Only time would tell. Sarah's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she stumbled down the darkened street. The cold night air seemed to cut through her skin, but it wasn't the temperature that sent shivers crawling up her spine. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sensation that she wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was just behind her, following her every step, even in the silence of the empty street. The shadows of the houses around her seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as though they were reaching out to grab her, to pull her back into the darkness. She kept running, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out the sound of her footsteps. The street lights flickered overhead, casting eerie pools of light that seemed to waver and fade as though they were struggling against something unseen. She glanced behind her, nothing, no one. But she couldn't shake the feeling, the sense that whatever she had left behind in that house wasn't far off, waiting, watching. The voice, the whisper from before, still echoed in her mind. Come back. Her mind raced. What did it want from her? Why her? She didn't know, but one thing was certain, she couldn't go back to that house. The figure, its cold, hollow eyes, its unnatural presence. No, she could never return there. As she continued down the street, she reached the corner and turned onto a dimly lit side road, hoping to find safety in the shadows. She had to make it to her friend's house, somewhere she could hide, somewhere she could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. But as she walked, she realized with a creeping horror that the streets seemed unfamiliar. The houses, which just moments ago had seemed so ordinary, now looked warped, distorted, as though they were not the same houses she had passed every day for years. The street signs, which had once been clear and easy to read, were now twisted, their letters scrambled, as if the world itself was bending around her. The world seemed to be shifting, changing. With every step she took, the town around her became more unrecognizable. The shadows grew deeper, darker, swallowing up the streetlights, making it harder to see where she was going. The wind began to pick up, howling through the trees, and Sarah couldn't help but feel as if the very air itself was charged with something unnatural, something malevolent. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stop, couldn't think about what was happening. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, to get away from whatever was following her. She glanced over her shoulder once more, her heart skipping a beat. There was nothing there, but the fear, the gut-wrenching terror, was enough to make her want to scream. And then, as if on cue, a faint noise drifted toward her, a soft, scraping sound, like nails on wood, coming from the alley just ahead. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, sharper, as though something, or someone, was coming closer. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. The scratching continued, and with it, a low, guttural voice whispered from the dark. It was faint, too quiet for her to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Something in it made her skin crawl. It was as if the voice was calling her, beckoning her toward the alley. Without thinking, Sarah ran. She sprinted down the street, her mind a blur of panic and confusion. The noise from behind her seemed to be growing louder, faster, as though whatever was pursuing her was closing the distance. The alley loomed ahead, dark and narrow, its entrance shrouded in shadow. The scratching continued, but now it sounded like it was coming from all directions, coming from within the walls themselves. She stopped for a moment, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She had to get away, had to find safety. But the alley was her only option. With trembling hands, she forced herself forward, stepping into the alley, her feet slapping against the cold concrete. The air here was even colder, the shadows more oppressive, and the scratching, oh God, the scratching was so loud now, so close. She could hear it all around her, as though the walls themselves were alive, moving, reaching out to her. And then, there it was. A figure stepped out from the darkness ahead. It wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form distorted and unnatural. Its body was unnervingly thin, its limbs stretched far beyond the proportions of any living creature. Its head was cocked to one side, its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The creature stood motionless, but its presence filled the alley, suffocating her, pressing in on her from all sides. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. And then, from behind her, she heard the voice again. This time, it was clear, unmistakable. Come back. It was the same voice. The same unnatural tone, but this time, it was closer. It was right behind her. With a burst of adrenaline, Sarah whipped around, her eyes searching desperately for the source of the voice. And then, she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing just behind her, in the shadow of the alley. It was him. The same figure. The one from her house. The one with the eyes. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized with growing horror that it wasn't just one figure. There were two. She was trapped. The coldness in the air seemed to intensify, freezing her to the bone, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the presence of the figures, the overwhelming sense that they were not from this world, not from any world she knew. "Come back," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. And then, as if on cue, the two figures took a step forward. Sarah snapped back to reality, her body surging with fear. She had to move. She had to get away. But her legs were still frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The figures were getting closer, their movements slow but deliberate, as though they were savoring her fear. She turned, not knowing what she was doing, and ran down the alley, her heart hammering in her chest. But as she ran, she could feel the walls closing in around her. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, longer than it should have been, as though the very path itself had become a trap, a maze with no escape. She glanced behind her again, but the figures were gone. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them, feel their presence, their eyes boring into her from the shadows. The darkness seemed to close in tighter, more oppressive, as though it were alive, wrapping around her, suffocating her. The voices grew louder, the whispers now turning into full-fledged calls, as if the very air was calling her name. "Come back." She felt her chest tighten, her lungs burning as she gasped for breath. But there was no escape. There was no way out. The alley twisted and bent unnaturally, as though the very landscape was shifting around her, bending to some unseen force. She couldn't find her way out. And then, she saw it. At the end of the alley, a door appeared, an old, rusted door, barely hanging on its hinges, almost hidden in the shadows. She ran toward it, desperate, her fingers trembling as she reached out to turn the handle. But before she could open it, the voice returned, low and ominous. "Do you really want to know what's behind that door?" The question hung in the air, as cold and menacing as the night itself. Sarah froze. The door, what was behind it? Was it an escape, or was it a trap? Would it lead her to safety, or would it take her deeper into the nightmare? With her hand still on the handle, she hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn and run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But she couldn't. The voice, the presence, the figures, they were all pulling her in, drawing her toward the unknown. She had no choice but to open the door. And so, she did. The door creaked open, revealing a room beyond, darker and colder than anything she had ever seen.